Yesterday, the Twitter Files Part 10, COVID Suppression, was released by David Zweig on Twitter. What was discovered by this latest drop was how the United States government pressured Twitter and other social media platforms to promote their own government-sanctioned message around COVID-19 while suppressing others. Both the Trump and Biden administrations pressured Twitter executives to spread the narratives they wanted to spread, even if they were false, with the Biden administration in particular targeting citizens with different viewpoints and pressuring Twitter to silence them. Here to give us more insight into what this latest drop revealed is David Zweig, author of several books and an independent journalist for New York, The Atlantic, The Free Press, and other outlets. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, so first of all, how did you even get involved in the Twitter Files drop? I mean, did Elon Musk call you directly? What was the process of getting involved, and what do these Twitter files actually look like? I mean, we see the threads, but what do you see on your end?
Right. Those are really good questions. So I got involved because I've written for Bari Weiss before, and I have a relationship with her. And my understanding of it is that Elon Musk gave two journalists, Matt Taibbi and Bari Weiss, access to the files. And then Bari has brought a few, I think maybe two or three journalists kind of under her umbrella to work with her. And she asked me to come out specifically to report on COVID-related matters in the Twitter files.
So what do the Twitter files look like then? I mean, were you given a database? Did you go to the Twitter headquarters? How do you even look through all of this, and how much information is there to look through?
Right. Yeah. Really good question. So I went out to San Francisco to Twitter's headquarters, and right, it's kind of the quote files is sort of this broad term, but we had access to internal emails and internal communications in places like Slack channels, and then also we had access to, I'm not sure the terminology, but what you might call sort of like the back end of Twitter, of looking at different like log data for different users and accounts, not looking at like personal data from users, but from how on a systems end, if certain tweets or accounts had certain tags added to them for things that were misleading or other things like that. This gave this sort of like detailed information. It's funny seeing some people criticizing whether my reporting on the files or other people's reporting. What they don't understand, I think, is that I couldn't just go in there, and it's not like doing a keyword search in your Gmail. This was really complicated to get in. We had an engineer in there helping us. There were other searches that they didn't allow us to do with the person in the room, but that were sent out to other people to do for us. And we had to search through very specific sort of channels, looking at specific names of employees, or if we were looking into the log files, it was a very complicated, tedious process to actually look up an individual user and then scroll through the data. These are not sort of like user-friendly systems that
Right.
designed for this type of research. So it was actually a really difficult process to get a lot of information in a short amount of time and figure out what was or wasn't important or useful.
Are you still looking through them for the COVID data information?
I'm back now. Well, I'm back on the East Coast, so I'm done for the time being, as far as I know. I'll have to see if Barry or wants me back, or what the ongoing arrangement is with access to the files.
So you have to be there physically. You can't take this stuff home and look through it on your computer.
Correct.
Oh. Okay, so let's talk about what you discovered in this. From what you wrote on Twitter in your thread, is that the Trump administration, first of all, did do some meddling, right? They pressured Twitter to censor. Really, it seemed from what they were looking to censor was the run on the grocery stores and the destruction of 5G cell towers. Is that what they were most concerned with?
I mean, yeah. So what I found was a summary from an internal email amongst some Twitter executives, where one of them, Lauren Culbertson, who is the head of U.S. public policy, basically summarized the demands and interactions with both the Trump and Biden White House. And as she characterized it, she talked about, specifically with the Trump White House, they had concerns about runs on grocery stores. And what I thought was interesting about that is, as we all know, there actually were runs on various goods. If you think back to the very beginning of the pandemic, early 2020. So we don't know precisely what, if anything, was flagged or taken down or in what way. All we know is that this specific request was put to Twitter regarding that. And to me, I find that type of thing concerning insofar as, if this is an avenue where people or as citizens are gaining information about the world, what does it mean if some of that information was correct, but was nevertheless labeled as misleading or perhaps even, blocked entirely from view on the site? Based on my other reporting, I certainly don't have full confidence that if the people at Twitter were doing some sort of moderation of that they only took down erroneous information. I certainly don't feel confident that they may not also have taken down perhaps correct information regarding various, grocery stores or whatever having runs on them. And I think that's important in a sort of like state of panic that was happening in the beginning of the pandemic, that people would actually want to know what's really going on.
Yeah, I think maybe what they were thinking in their mind, because, all of this, whenever there's any sort of censorship, it always comes from the place of, well, this is for the greater good, right? This is what we must do in order to help people. This is the right thing to do. And that's where it always comes from. It's that good intentions sort of thing, which we know that the path to hell is paved in good intentions, right? But so it seems like maybe what they were trying to do on this, and I'm not making an excuse for it at all, but they were trying to prevent more runs on grocery stores by saying there's no run on a grocery store. Because if you and I think there is a run on a grocery store and people are saying there's runs on the grocery store, then we're going to go running to the grocery store because we're thinking, oh my gosh, we're not going to have any food. So it causes even, it's like an avalanche effect. So maybe that's what they were trying to mitigate, which,
I'm certainly sympathetic to that. If I was in charge of a government of a country and there's a pandemic and people are starting to freak out, I'm sympathetic to the idea that they didn't want the scenario that you were describing. I don't know the right answer, other than that my instinct says it's not to suppress correct information about the world that is actually occurring. I don't think that's the way to get people to sort of, mold their behavior. I think we have to, it's obvious, needless to say, it's the, slippery slope cliche. So, I mean, if this stuff was actually happening and we know it was, to me, it's pretty worrisome because, again, who's to say, there's no way in real time that they were accurately adjudicating, every video or every report of this type of thing happening. And as a citizen, right, you might want to know, shit, I better get to the store if they're going to run out of food or whatever it may be.
Right.
And maybe that wasn't the scenario, in this pandemic, but if there's some other sort of crisis, and this is, imagine there's a hurricane or something that came down and X, Y, and Z is happening, and then you have a state government contacting social media saying, hey, we don't want you to, allow any posts on X, Y, or Z happening. So, that's the risk we run of governments kind of, interfering in this manner, I think.
So I know that the Biden administration, according to your thread, did a lot of censoring of individuals. They wanted certain narratives to be the anti-vaxxers, right? They wanted to go after the anti-vaxxers. Did you, and we'll get to the Biden administration, we'll talk about that, but still focusing on Trump, did they do any of that? I mean, it seems like it was a lot of stopping narratives of runs on grocery stores, like I said, 5G cell towers, trying to stop them from being destroyed by people who are maybe sabotaging them. But did they go after individuals in an effort to silence what they were saying?
Yeah, I didn't see evidence of that from the Trump administration. That doesn't mean they weren't doing it. I only had limited access to, some of these emails. So it's entirely possible that there were all sorts of other demands and, and requests being made. They just weren't in this email summary that I had access to. And,
Okay.
not surprisingly, I think it's unlikely that anyone, is going to find an email from a government official with like a bullet list of demands. It may exist, but from all the information I've seen, things don't typically work that way between governments and private companies in their communications.
So let's talk about what the Biden administration did. It looks like when they got in there, they really did start to meddle a lot more. I mean, did it seem more prominent to you what the requests they were making of Twitter?
Well, certainly the way it was characterized was a lot more in depth. And they, as you noted, well, you were sort of, I think, may have been alluding to Trump, but as it was characterized at the Biden White House, they were very concerned about what they, viewed as misinformation relating to the vaccines and specifically, quote, anti-vaxxer accounts. And as the meetings were characterized, that the White House was, quote, very angry that Twitter was not doing more to deplatform a number of accounts.
So they were pointing out specific people and saying, silence them, essentially.
That's correct. They met the one person that I saw mentioned by name was Alex Berenson, that the White House talked about. So, this is how the interactions were characterized, and needless to say, this raises all sorts of First Amendment questions. I've spoken with the attorney, one of them who's working on, who's suing the government right now on behalf of several individuals who were suppressed by Twitter and other social media platforms. And according to her and some other legal scholars who I've corresponded with, this certainly raises First Amendment issues. Although the government, quote, wasn't directly suppressing a particular citizen, they were essentially attempting or succeeding in using social media platforms as a vehicle toward that censorship. So in effect, it was merely just a proxy in the middle.
Yeah, I kind of wonder why Elon Musk himself, now that he owns Twitter, doesn't actually bring about a lawsuit on behalf of Twitter. I mean, I understand the individuals saying, hey, we believe that the government was pressuring Twitter to censor us. That is an infringement on our First Amendment rights. But it seems like Twitter itself as a company would have a First Amendment right and would be able to say the government pressured us to do these things. We didn't want to do it, but they kind of said, or else face regulation, threatening Section 230, a variety of things, carting us into Congress, forcing us to answer questions. It just seems like there maybe would be a case from that angle. I don't know. It just seems that way. But I want to talk more about Alex Berenson. So he was targeted by the Biden administration as an anti-vaxxer. They demanded something be done about him. People have been bringing this up, people that have been looking at the files. They've actually criticized the files by saying that bringing up Alex Berenson as an example, because they say, this guy has been saying a lot of he has been spreading a lot of misinformation, according to them. And so when you use him as an example, it actually undermines the entire effort of the Twitter files. What do you make of that criticism?
Yeah, I mean, basically, my reporting that I did for the Free Press, that's Barry Weiss's new media venture, and then also the corresponding Twitter thread that I did, was really, I mean, I don't know the percentage, but 80%, 90% of it, the whole idea was focused on largely credentialed scientists, physicians, and or regular people who are citing credible data, stuff published in journals, that are peer reviewed, data from the CDC itself. And I wanted to center my reporting on those people and that material that was suppressed in some way by Twitter. I did mention Berenson only specifically because he's cited by name from the White House. So when we're talking about this larger issue, surrounding COVID and how it is, how the platform was moderating content related to COVID, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention Berenson, who's been a big player in there. But my reporting has nothing to do with Berenson's claims one way or the other. And quite honestly, I haven't tracked a lot of his tweets and and Substacks over the past couple of years, so I don't know specifically what he was or wasn't saying. My sort of general impression is, from what I have read from him, some of what he says has very much been very prescient and true. Yeah. Other things he has said, I have been not persuaded by. And I think, their sense is from a lot of people in, the third category, some of what he has said has been wrong, just flat wrong. And he certainly, is a gadfly. I think he certainly has, that sort of very, needling nature against people and the sort of, powers that be. So, but I think the focus on Berenson really is a distraction to me from what I wanted to reveal in my reporting.
Yeah, that's what it seems like to me as well, is that people are just kind of bringing it up to undermine the Twitter files, saying, oh, well, but you are pointing out an actual example of actual misinformation, which I don't agree. I'm with you on this. I've seen, I haven't followed Alex specifically, in depth, but I've seen him make a lot of really accurate, truthful claims. And maybe, I'm sure he's made some claims that are not accurate. It seems during this pandemic, everyone has said something that is inaccurate, including the government. Very much so the government, Fauci himself. I mean, the man who is science, right? So everybody's been wrong during the pandemic at some point. Some people have been right. Pointing out Alex Berenson, this criticism that you're getting about that, to me, is missing the point of the files, which is it doesn't matter whether he was right or wrong some of the time. What matters is the government targeted him and said, silence this man. How is that not a direct infringement on the First Amendment? The fact that the government would do it. One thing that I also thought was interesting in the files was that you said that the company, Twitter, actually took a bit more time to debate the censorship more so than the government, which I find really interesting, that the company would take pause and say, I don't know, should we be censoring people? This is like First Amendment territory. Whereas the government, which should know, the Biden administration should know the First Amendment better than a private company, theoretically, yet they're the ones trying to strong arm them into silencing Americans. I found that to be really interesting in the files. Did you find that Twitter did give a lot of pushback, or were they mostly compliant?
Yeah, it's such a great point, and I had a similar reaction as you're describing. The fact that the White House communications were characterized as being very angry, that Twitter was not as compliant, with their wishes as the White House wanted, I think is really telling. And the fact that they had multiple conversations that were described as, quote, very angry. So if you're a private company and you are, a multi-billion-dollar national, multinational operation, of course, you're subject to all sorts of regulation from the government. So whether it's, quote, a request or a demand is, kind of neither here nor there. Anyone running a company knows that when, it's sort of like when you get the call from, can you do me a favor? Is it really a request for a favor? So I thought it was really interesting that, at least the way it was characterized, that Twitter did not, just immediately do what the White House wanted. The White House was very angry. And then furthermore, from my research while I was there at Twitter, I saw over and over again Twitter employees really debating and working hard at trying to make good decisions. And I found myself much more sympathetic toward Twitter than I was going into it. My assumptions were wrong to some extent, where I assumed maybe they just kind of had this big, axe that they were swinging on various Twitter accounts and types of information, and that they were, just kind of doing the government's bidding. It's not entirely clear how much of the suppression that took place on Twitter was a result of pressure from the White House, and how much of it was, just their own kind of ideas on the inside. It's clear that the White House did put enormous pressure on them. So we know that is a factor. It's just, there's no way to know how much of a factor.
Right. So Dr. Martin Kulldorff is a well-respected Harvard epidemiologist, and he said he didn't believe everyone needed to be vaccinated, that those who were previously infected and people who were young were not high risk. And so he was saying in his tweet, the thought that everyone needs to be vaccinated is as flawed as the thought that no one needs to be vaccinated. There are certain groups that should be and certain groups that shouldn't, essentially, is what he was saying. And that tweet was labeled as misleading. Other tweets were labeled as misleading, even if they used the CDC's own data. So I'm curious, through all of the investigation you did through these files, what scientific barometer was Twitter even using? Did they
You
even
know,
have like well, we follow the WHO or we follow Fauci out, without even thinking about it? I mean, what were they using if CDC's own data and a Harvard epidemiologist would be considered fake news?
right. I mean, the general parameters that they appeared to follow were essentially whatever the CDC says. And if you had a view that seemed to differ from sort of official policy from the CDC and then later from the Biden administration, which sort of worked in unison with the CDC, their messaging was generally on point, and in concert with each other, or not only just a view, but if you presented evidence, such as the CDC data itself, that sort of made a case that went against kind of some of these CDC guidelines and government policies, even the evidence itself was suppressed. So it was both the opinions of people, including credentialed experts like Martin Kulldorff at Harvard, or whether it's from experts or regular citizens who are who are posting actual data from the CDC and other credible sources. But if that data, the example I gave was from a user who had posted mortality statistics from the CDC itself for pediatrics related to various causes of death. And she was showing, look, COVID is not the leading cause of death amongst children. It's just not. It never has been. And that tweet was labeled as misleading, even though in her tweet, she actually took a screenshot of CDC data showing this to be the case.
Yeah. So did you walk away from all of this? I mean, what did you walk away from this feeling and thinking? I mean, what can we even do about all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a good question because I found myself wanting to try to suggest what should have been done or what should be done in the future. And then I found myself sort of pulling back from that a little bit. And at least for now, just trying to reveal and report. So, which I hope, I guess what good investigative journalism should do is just bring information into the sunlight for people to know about. I don't have a clear answer. I don't think anyone does on what exactly makes sense for a social media platform to do. I think most people would probably prefer to not be on a platform that was just overrun with just absolute garbage nonsense, from QAnon or other things that aren't true. I'm not saying a private company doesn't have the right to, block that if they want or to leave it on there if they want. But I think most people probably wouldn't want to be in an environment that's overrun with that. Yet on the other hand, when you have a private company trying to moderate that type of content, it seems that inevitably they wind up moderating, quote, suppressing all sorts of content that actually is very legitimate. And what I show in my reporting is that I think one of the reasons that happens is, we're talking about just massive amounts of information. A lot of it's done through an automated process with bots. And what happens is through machine learning and AI, these bots are sort of trained to look for certain content that may have been really wild and out there and just totally wrong and even harmful. But in the process, these bots are not going to be able to find and only find the wrong stuff. They're also going to pick out a lot of things that are correct. And that's where we run the risk. It's like, do you want to over censor and which appears to have been the case here where they were sort of more aggressive, or do you want to be less aggressive and perhaps let a lot more stuff that's BS and nonsense through, but in doing so, you're also allowing in a lot more accurate information, that particularly so that people aren't finding elsewhere because it certainly wasn't being covered by the mainstream media by and large.
Yeah, that's for sure. David, thank you for being here. Tell us about your upcoming book you've got coming out, An Abundance of Caution. What is that about?
The book is about American schools during the pandemic. And I basically wanted to look at the decision-making behind the process that happened. What happened in America where you had kids in places like California and elsewhere who didn't set foot in their school building for more than a year, when this basically did not happen in any other, developed country in the West, certainly throughout Europe. So I'm trying to dissect the kind of decision-making processes that happened that led to this, what I view as a completely unacceptable, unnecessary, and disastrous consequence.
Yeah. And on that note, actually, we're going to be speaking to an FBI whistleblower next who actually blew the whistle on the attorney general actually labeling a lot of these very angry parents that were upset about what was going on during the pandemic, labeling them as essentially as domestic terrorists, surveilling them, going after them. People are upset. They were upset about what was going on with their children. They were upset that their kids weren't getting their educations. They were wearing masks. All of these things were going on. It was just definitely going to be interesting reading your book, An Abundance of Caution, because I worry about those kids and how they're going. I worry about that generation, what they were put through, what they're still put through, and how that's going to affect them as they mature into adulthood. And then those of us, when we're old, we're going to be reliant on them. They're going to be the ones running Congress when we're old. Right.
Yeah.
So.
Well, yeah. Thanks for your, interest and concern, and obviously I share it. And one of the things that I've focused on for close to 3 years now is because so much of the media, oftentimes in America, doesn't cover what's happening abroad, or they only do so through a very specific lens. Very early on, it was clear to me that things were happening very differently in other countries, particularly so throughout Europe. Kids there started going back to school at the end of April and the beginning of May, whereas here that did not happen in America. We're talking about more than 50 million healthy kids who were kept home from school. This is unprecedented. And, someone, I guess it's me, has to shed light on what exactly happened. I'm less interested in the reporting on sort of, the victimhood of children being home and running through anecdotes of just horrible things happening to them. Some other journalists have done that reporting, and it's really important, and I'm glad they did. But for me, I really want to understand the decision-making process. What were the mechanisms at play, political, sociological, et cetera, that led to these decisions where America took such a different route than other places?
Yeah. All right, David, thank you so much for joining us. David Zweig, author of several books, and including his upcoming book, An Abundance of Caution. You can check that out. David, thank you for being here.
Thanks, Kim.